Welcome to Mets Pro Talk, and this is going to be the first episode as we get into the offseason for 2026 for the New York Mets. And I think the best topic to start with here on our first episode is going to be talking about the elephant in the room, Pete Alonso. There's a lot of things to unpack here when it comes to Pete Alonso, so let's dive right into it. Number one, what is his actual value to this team? The issue that I have with the way that the fan base views Pete Alonso is that it's almost always one of two things that are said, and they're both very indicative of why fan bases can help or hurt a team when they're making decision making, because fan influence does affect roster building. If a fan base is loud enough and they're emotional enough and they're involved enough and they're threatening enough, like, team decisions get made based off those things. And so we saw it last year when Pete was a free agent coming into the season. Mets fans were talking about give Pete whatever he wants, give him a blank check. Like, dude, I've seen all the forums, I've read all the comments, I've been in these discussions, I've seen it, so don't act like you weren't one of them, because I know you were, okay? And, there was a lot of fan influence because Mets fans, like any other fan base, it's not just Mets fans, it's all fan bases are like this. But you have this emotional attachment to a homegrown player, and it's very difficult for you to let it go. And it's hurt in the past with guys like Jose Reyes leaving, right? Like, that's a guy who was beloved by the Mets fan base. He was coming off a batting title, and then, won his batting title, left to Miami for significantly more money. But then his career was kind of derailed by injuries, and so it actually ended up working in the Mets' favor that way. And look, I like Jose Reyes a lot. He's one of my favorite players. But like, that's a perfect example of a Mets fan base really, really being emotional about wanting to keep your homegrown player, and then him leaving, having one good season there when they went out and got all those guys. They got the Mark Burleys and all that. But he left, and then he got injured, and his contract ended up being a huge disappointment. And so I'm not saying that's the same with Pete Alonso. That's what's going to happen. But I think that we just overvalue his production because he's homegrown. And look, Pete Alonso's not stupid. Scott Boras isn't stupid. What they're doing is they're playing into the narrative and hoping that there is a team desperate enough to bid up on Pete Alonso's services so that Pete's going to get the best deal anywhere. He's not going to re-sign. He's not going to give a hometown discount, and nor does he deserve an open check, like fans have said in the past many, many times. And so you start to unpack and look at the layers of his production and his value of who he is as a player. We know a couple things. Number one, he's getting older, right? He's in his early 30s, but presumably he wants a 7-year deal, which would take him into his late 30s. We already know that the power is going to be, it's going to diminish over time. So by the end of the contract, it's not going to be a good deal. We haven't seen a power hitting first baseman who signed a long-term deal in their early 30s and it's ever worked out, ever. And that's including Albert Pujols, who is arguably the greatest hitter in MLB history before he signed with Anaheim. And so when you're looking at the guy who was arguably the greatest hitter of all time, outside of maybe Barry Bonds, and yeah, he was a power hitter. I was going to say Tony Gwynn. Tony Gwynn was an incredible hitter as well, but like, when you're looking at like comparables, Pete Alonso's a slugging first baseman like Albert Pujols was, who also happened to slug and hit for average. Pujols' contract ended up being horrible, right? And so that's kind of the comparable that we're looking at with Pete Alonso, where it's like his power is going to diminish, his ability to put bat to ball is going to diminish, guys are only throwing harder. So as his bat speed goes down and fastballs are getting faster and faster, like, just common sense tells you that a long-term contract for a power hitting first baseman whose defensive skills have already been diminished to zero. He was terrible last year. It's not going to work. Now, you look at the broader issue, right? We take away the emotional attachment, right? David Stearns doesn't have this attachment to these players. David Stearns grew up a Mets fan. He grew up in New York. He wants to win for this team, but he's also intelligent enough to make decisions based on data and not on emotion, which as a fan, you do the exact opposite. You want things based off emotion. You want the guy that you perceive to be the better player right now, and you completely negate the future. And this is why roster building is so important, because you need to take into account both who's someone that can produce right now and someone who can produce in the future. And then you try not to intertwine that, because typically the guys who are not going to produce in the future, but they produce now, are going to cost you more. And with roster flexibility, with caps, right? Right now, MLB has no salary cap. There's going to be a lockout and there's going to be a salary cap. The players aren't going to sit out for 2 seasons. They may sit out for 1. They're not sitting out for 2. And MLB owners are the billionaires. They can sit it out as long as they want. They're not really going to be losing money because they're not paying players during that time. So the people getting hurt the most are the players. And the longer they sit out, the longer they're going without playing baseball, which means that when they do come back, you're going to have a really, really terrible level of play for an entire season as people ramp back up and get back up to speed into baseball. And so it's not looking good for players. This offseason also throws an extra layer of difficulty for Pete Alonso, specifically for Pete Alonso, because like I said, he is going to try to get his long-term contract. The Mets do not want to give him that. The fans want to give him that. They want to give him a blank check. But you're talking about a guy who is going to play 1 more season, then he's going to sit out a season, okay? And then he's going to have to come back and try to ramp back up after missing an entire season, because there is going to be a lockout. MLB, the Players Association and the owners are so far off already on agreement, and MLB owners are already talking about a salary cap when it really should just be a salary floor. But you can't have a floor without a cap, so it's going to be interesting to see. The Mets already have the highest payroll in baseball. When you're talking about money owed today, obviously the Dodgers have the highest payroll, but they've basically put their entire roster on credit for the future. And so you're looking at a team who is spending the most money. Apparently, according to the last article that came out, they apparently lost $350 million. I don't know how accurate that is, considering that last season they lost $110 million in revenue, and last season we had the most fans ever at the stadium, like ever in Mets history. And so you look at how much revenue was actually brought in versus what our payroll was, including like the fines for going over the Steve Cohen tax. 350 mil sounds a little bit ridiculous, but regardless, we still lost a lot of money. So even though I believe that to be a completely inaccurate article as far as the numbers are concerned, the fact that we did lose money is probably very, very realistic and very accurate. It's just the number amount is probably inaccurate. But back to the topic. So Pete Alonso, so he's regressed incredibly, like, bad. Like, he's regressed so bad, it's embarrassing. He went from one of the better defensive first basemen to arguably the worst defensive first baseman in baseball. Can't throw a baseball. Very, very reminiscent of Lucas Duda in that regard. And really his calling card was his ability to pick the baseball out of the dirt on bad throws. And when you look at last year's defensive alignment, you have a combination of Brett Beatty, Mark Vientos, Ronnie Mauricio, and in a pinch, Jeff McNeil playing third base. Not very good options defensively at third base. Brett Beatty's probably our best option there, and he's probably a better fit to be a second baseman than a third baseman. He wasn't terrible at third, but he's made some mistakes there. Some could be just due to not having enough playing time consistently at third base. But the reality is that Lindor likes to short hop a lot of throws. He gets to a lot of baseballs that shortstops typically don't get to. He gets plays off that most guys don't get to. And sometimes he's going to throw one hoppers over there. And Pete has historically been very, very good at picking short hops at first. Last season, not very good. Defensively, catching ground balls, not very good. Throwing to first base, the worst I've ever seen in my entire life. I've seen 6-year-olds play better defense at first base with their ability to throw the baseball to first base to a pitcher covering the bag better than Pete Alonso. He has the yips that are like very reminiscent of like Chuck Knobloch when he played with the Yankees and he caught the yips. Like, cannot throw to first base. How many times did he almost injure someone, or actually did injure someone, trying to throw a baseball to first, and he couldn't do it. And it just blows my mind because it's the easiest throw in the sport to make. 4 feet, just lob it to the bag, right? He couldn't do it. So Pete has basically put himself in a position where it's like he's slugging DH at this point who can't be trusted to play first base. And his calling is that he hits for power, he does hit for RBIs, and he does play every single day. I mean, this guy doesn't miss baseball. He is incredibly durable and dependable with being in the lineup. But like the rest of our roster, he is completely inconsistent with the bat. And so when you're looking at all these things and what David Stearns values, which is defense first, the ability to prevent runs as opposed to having to drive in runs, that's a winning formula. We've seen it. Toronto had incredible defense. They got to Game 7 and arguably should have won that World Series. They made some, IFKs mess up by not taking a lead at third and then not taking a secondary lead, not being held on, and then being thrown out at the plate like in a fraction of a second. Like, without those things, Toronto wins the World Series, and they win it because they put the ball in play, which the Mets team does not do. We don't hit for contact, right? We're very, very inconsistent offense, which, when we do hit the ball, we are as explosive and as dangerous as any lineup in baseball. But a lot of times we're not, because we don't have guys who put the bat on the ball. Toronto does. And you see how good they looked in the World Series compared to the Dodgers, who basically just like scratched and clawed, and their pitching kept them in every single game. And when you have 12 aces on your roster, and you have a full rotation and a full bullpen of $100 million starters, that's the only reason why they won the World Series. Toronto was the better team. So Toronto's defense got them to the World Series. Their ability to put bat to ball got them to the World Series, took them in 7 games. That's what Stearns is trying to do. He's trying to put together a roster that can defend the baseball, that can pitch the baseball, and that can put the ball in play. Power is overrated in baseball, and so are statistics, to the extent that we overvalue certain things. So we talk about the emotional impact of Pete Alonso and leaving the Mets, but we don't talk about the second part, which is like the thing that almost every Mets fan in a forum who's casual is going to say, give him a blank check, and then it's either going to be that, or it's going to be give Pete Alonso a blank check, or you can't replace 35 home runs and 120 RBIs. Those are the two things that every casual Mets fan says, because they can't really formulate an argument any other way. And it's very easy to look at like an overlying stat like that and say, yeah, there's not very many guys on the market who you can replace 32 home runs and 120 RBIs. But what David Stearns is trying to do, and what he's trying to say, and what I hope to convey here, is that you don't need to replace 35 home runs and 120 RBIs from one person. Okay? You can do that with defensive runs saved on defense by getting a better defense. If you can save an extra 20 runs a year purely just from just having better defensive alignment, That takes away 20 RBIs from Pete that have been replaced just on defense. Then you look at getting better pitching. If you get better pitchers who can save you another 30 runs a season compared to what you have in place currently, right? Like getting rid of Frankie Montes, getting rid of, I don't want to say Clay Holmes because he was incredible last season, but like Tyler Megill, right? Like you get rid of those guys and you replace it with a guy who can save you an additional 30 runs a year with the same amount of innings pitched. That's another 30 RBIs that have been replaced from Pete Alonso's bat, right? So you can save runs on the defensive end and on the pitching end that doesn't have to necessarily tie directly back to Pete Alonso. And then you go out and you can get someone like Alex Bregman who fits a need, right? He can play third base, he can play short, he can play second, he can play first, right? You save runs with Bregman's glove. That's another, let's say, 10 DRS, right? You could save another 10 runs from Bregman. I don't know what his exact numbers are. I'm not going to pull it up, but like you're saving runs defensively by having someone like Bregman compared to Pete Alonso. And then you look at his offensive numbers and they're pretty similar. I mean, he'll get you 28 to 32 plus home runs a year. So the power is going to be the same. And the RBIs, he might get you 80 to 100 RBIs. And so when you look at defensive alignment, pitching, and you look at offensive and defensive production, Bregman, a good starting pitcher and a good defensive alignment is going to surpass anything that Pete Alonso does personally. And then when you also look at what like Pete Alonso brings to the table offensively, we forget to always mention what he costs us defensively. And so really he might end up being like a 29, I mean, the home runs is still the same, but like the RBIs is the only thing that really matters. Home runs don't matter. RBIs matter. That's the runs that are driven in. So like even if he costs you 10 runs, then he goes from 120 to 110 RBIs. But you can replace all that defensively, offensively, with good starting pitching, with good relief pitching. Like you don't need Pete Alonso. He's a nice to have bat, but not at the cost of what he's going to do in the future. Now you look at what David Stearns is trying to build, and David Stearns wants to build a young, controllable talent so we can keep our salary down, have flexibility to build around our core, and then you just fill in with free agency. That's how every winning team does it. You build your core internally, and then you find free agency to replace internally. That's how you do it. But Mets fans don't understand that. They want to just extend the core. Like, the Dodgers don't extend their core. They trade their core away. They build their core internally, they let them play, and then right when they get to free agency, they usually trade it off for more assets, and then they replace it in free agency where it doesn't cost you those prospects. Like, it's a winning formula, especially if you have the money to do it. So when I'm looking at David Stearns and his philosophy of trying to build a young, controllable talent that is cost and team friendly so that we could have more roster and financial flexibility moving forward. At the end of the day, also, guys, this is a business and businesses need to run at a profit in order to stay. Steve Cohen is not going to keep doling out losses of hundreds of millions of dollars every single year forever just to make you happy. Like, he's just not going to do it. No person in their right mind would continue to do that. So we need to let them build this roster the way it needs to be built. When you're looking at what David Stearns is trying to do, he doesn't want to block Ryan Clifford. Ryan Clifford is very clearly like the first baseman of the future in David Stearns' mind. We went out, we traded for him. He's a big power bat from the left side, like a left-handed swinging power bat that plays first, and he can play the outfield, mostly right field, but Soto's out there for the next 700 years. So he's going to be our first baseman of the future, and they're not going to block him. And the thing that I don't understand, and this is a different part of our roster, is that David Stearns, and I agree with the way David Stearns' thinking goes a lot of times, but the one thing I can't get behind is David Stearns views the DH spot as a way to give people a day off defensively and kind of keep it as like this open spot in the lineup to kind of just get guys in there, as opposed to having a dedicated DH. And I come from like an era of baseball where you are a starting third baseman, shortstop. You have your starting spot on the lineup, and that's your spot. and you have your spot in the lineup, and that's where you stay. And David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza, they have this thing where it's like DH is like this ever revolving spot in the order, and then the lineup shifts every single game. And as a player, it's impossible for you to get into a rhythm like that when you're hitting in a different spot in the order every week, when you're hitting in a different position every day. Like, I would love to see the Mets just kind of commit to Mark Vientos as the DH. I think we've already seen that if he is on, he is as good offensively as Pete Alonso is offensively. We have also seen the other side of Vientos where it's like he's also terrible. And so I get that there is a lot of people who may look at that and scoff at it and say, oh, Vientos is terrible. He had a horrible year. He can't defend. I'm not asking him to defend. I want him to DH. I want his bat in the lineup. He's clutch. He has power. He can hit. Like, he just can't run and he can't defend. And we don't need him to do that as a DH. We just need him to hit the ball and hit it, like, when it matters. And if you put him in a DH spot and you put him in the spot in the order where he could just hit consistently every single day, and regardless of his performance, he can be there consistently and know mentally that he's going into the same spot and his job's not at risk for an entire season, I think it allows comfort for you to get yourself into a rhythm at the plate. And when Mark Vientos is swinging a hot bat, he's as good as anybody in baseball. And I don't care what anyone says. We've already seen it. And we've seen it over the course of almost an entire season. So it's not a fluke. I just think that he's kind of at a crossroads where, you know, he can't afford to get off to a slow start because we have too many people vying for the same spot. And I think it hurt the Mets last season because you had Brett Baty, Mark Vientos, and Ronnie Mauricio, three highly touted prospects, all playing the same position, vying for the same spot, and neither one of them being allowed or allotted enough opportunities to get into a rhythm. And so it hurt all of them. And Brett Baty ended up being the most versatile of the three because he had the ability to go play second. He had the ability to play left. Like, he made himself more durable and more available as a utility man, which gave him more at-bats, which allowed him to settle in eventually with his bat and start hitting the ball pretty decently. He looked good. As much as I dislike Brett Baty personally, you know, not that I dislike him as a person, but just as a ball player, he reminds me of like a lesser version of Bryson Stott. I want him on my roster. I just don't want him as a starting player on my roster. I don't think that he's a player who is going to benefit the team in our World Series aspirations. With that being said, I'm curious to see what David Stearns does going into the season. I think we're going to see a lot of moves. But when it comes to Pete Alonso, my thought is this: let Pete walk, let him go. He's going to end up either in Tampa, Anaheim, or the Yankees. And if he does, great, let him go. He's going to have probably 2 more great years left in him, and then he's going to be a disaster moving forward. I personally believe that. I just can't foresee him continuing into his mid to late 30s, especially with the lockout looming, missing a full season of his contract and still being good after that. I just can't see it happening. And I don't think that it's worth the amount of money and the amount of years that he wants. And for people, just give him a short-term deal, high AAV. We already have a $350 million payroll. Like, you're not going to give this guy $40 million a year, $35 million a year to be a DH who's not good defensively, and he's going to be hitting a lockout. So even if you give him a 4-year deal, you're probably going to get 3 years out of him. And if you get 3 years out of him, you're really only getting 2 good years out of him. The first one, which is next year, and then it's lockout, so you're missing out that year. The year after that, he's probably going to be terrible because everyone's going to be coming back after a year off. And then the 4th year is going to be his contract year, so he's probably going to have a good year after that. And we're going to be right back in the same discussion of bring Pete back. So I would like to see Stearns stick to the script, his script of sticking to the guns. We don't take Pete Alonso, let him walk, go out, get better defensively, go get Cody Bellinger to play center field, right? He could play first base this season. You get Bellinger to play first base this season. Clifford should be up by mid-season. right? He's at AAA level. He hit well last season. If he's ready to go by midseason, you call Clifford up, put him at first base, move Bellinger back to center field. You let Mark Vientos DH. If Vientos is not swinging the bat well, you move Brandon Nimmo from full-time left field to a full-time DH because his bat is still going to be decent, and you get rid of the worst defensive player that we have on our team, and then you go get a good defensive left fielder. It doesn't need to be a superstar, just someone who can actually defend the baseball well, someone with a good glove. Maybe that's just putting Tyrone Taylor back in center field, and then you move Bellinger to left, whatever the case may be. But you don't need 9 bats in the lineup who are gonna just crush a ball. Tyrone Taylor in center field is an excellent option. Put Bellinger in left after Clifford gets called up, and then go get a third baseman. Go get Bregman. You can have Francisco. Here's the thing: our defense is not, our lineup is not terrible. Our core is not terrible. You have Francisco Alvarez, who's 23 years old behind the plate. Nolan McLean is older than Francisco Alvarez. Alvarez feels like he's been around forever. Nolan McLean, who just made his debut, is older than Francisco Alvarez. Brandon Sproat is older than Francisco Alvarez. So our team is very young, very talented. You have Alvarez behind the plate. You go get Bregman for third base. You trade off probably Ronnie Mauricio, right? Beatty at second. You trade off Jeff McNeil. You have Lindor at second. You have Bellinger at first until he gets moved over when Clifford gets called up. Soto in right, Tyrone Taylor in center, and then you have someone to fill in. You have Nimmo in left until Clifford gets called up and everyone shifts around. It's not difficult. You're not going to see a ton of huge moves from the defense. You're going to see probably Ronnie Mauricio traded. You're going to see Pete Alonso walk. And then we're going to get pitching. Starting pitching is what we need, but we also need to trade off some of these guys. So that's a different video for a different day. That's my take on Pete Alonso. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what David Stearns and Pete Alonso are going to do in the comments, and I look forward to talking to you guys on the next episode.